Under Finance Budget Report, administration will update the board on fiscal year 2018 budget development. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
It's good, nice to see you, Susan. You know a whole lot more than you did last time, right?
Oh, sure. I've got all the answers. Thank you, Mike. Well, good evening, President Logan, Superintendent Allison, members of the board, Dr. Thompson. We are completed through day 108 of the legislative session, the second longest legislative session now in state history. And as you can imagine, since we've passed day 100, there's been a flurry of activity going on the past week and a half or so, including the fact that the House did pass its substitute version of House Bill 2410. The Senate then passed its substitute version of House Bill 2186. And those two bills then went into conference committee where negotiators kind of worked those two bills. And over the weekend, they came to an agreement, reached an agreement, and that bill is now known as SB 19. And SB 19 is now the school finance formula proposal that was sent to the House earlier today. It was also linked to a tax package, and it was voted down in the House today and sent back to committee. So that's the latest I know of legislative happenings, is that we're back now in the conference committee where hopefully it might unlink from a tax package and perhaps have a better chance as it moves forward. But if we want to talk a little bit about Senate Bill 19, in its structure, it looks a lot like our old school finance formula. It returns to weightings for at-risk, bilingual, transportation, CTE. It's very, it's got a few tweaks, but generally it looks a lot like the old formula in its form and structure. Therefore, we do believe it probably would pass constitutional muster because it mirrors the old formula with maybe a few tweaks. So that's the good news.
With the caveat, the devil's always in the details. So while the Supreme Court didn't give the legislature safe harbor and recreate the old formula, and you'll be fine, there are some issues around capital outlay and some others that some of the proposals would create equity issues again, because it would definitely favor high wealth versus high poverty school districts. So, you know, what happens is you hear the discussion and there's never the exact printed bill because it's so fluid at this stage. So we believe that has good chance, but it's always about what are the details that are there on and how the court will look at those details when we get to that point.
Okay, so as we look at the overall funding in the bill for statewide additional funding, year one, the bill would appear to put about $187. I've seen some numbers as high as $194 million. Year one, that's $4,006 base state aid per pupil. Year two, there would be $98 million new dollars going in, and the base state aid per pupil would increase to $4,128. To put those numbers into perspective, our base aid per pupil in the 2008-2009 period was $4,400. So just year one base aid is actually 9% lower than what we had in 2008-2009. Also compare that to where our base aid was for the 2014-15 school year before the block grant, when the base aid was $3,852. That's only a 4% increase in 4 school years. So that's where the bill currently sits. So those figures certainly beg the question, would this be deemed adequate funding by the court? So if we look at those year one and year two figures under SB 19 compared to the state Board of Education recommendations for adequate funding, the state BOE is recommending $566 million year one, $327 million year two, for a total of $893 million over 2 years. The trial court was close behind that at $823 million over 2 years. And the legislature's own cost studies showed it would take $1.4 billion to meet adequacy. So the 290 million, give or take, under SB 19 certainly seems to raise some real concerns of whether the court would deem that to be adequate in having all Kansas students meet the ROSE capacities. Just to dig a little bit into the details, and I would caution by digging a little bit into the details, nothing is final at this point. Again, they've thrown it all back into conference committee. It could easily change and will change probably before we're all said and done. But right now, in year one, if we look at just what 259 potentially it would be looking at, it would be $11.1 million more in general and LOB state aid, $13.9 million in weighted or targeted funds, including special ed. Year two is $9.8 million. And that definitely, especially year one, seems like a lot of money. But when you look, as a reminder, we're sitting on $8.2 million of cost increases, which are almost predominantly general fund cost increases. So we've eaten up a good chunk of that, of the money in the general fund in LOB year one. Year two, we're at the same place where there's just not a lot of leftover to do much with. Remember, those targeted funds have to be spent for specific reasons. There seemed to be some particular focus at the legislative level on at-risk and how we spend at-risk dollars, so we'll have to really look at that as we move forward. Also, at those levels, again, remembering that we've essentially cut almost $98 million over the past 8 years, we've got quite a hole to dig out of. So 25 million sounds like a big number, but when you compare it to where we've been over the past 8 years, it's going to take us a long time at that pace to get out of the hole. Okay, so that begs the question then, what will happen on June 30th as the deadline still exists, where the block grant sunsets and we don't have a finance formula? Typically at this point in time, we would be looking at what might have happened the last time we shut down, but in this case, we can't do that. There is no past precedent. It's very difficult to plan because we don't have any guideposts to tell us, here's how it worked 10 years ago, here's how it worked 5 years ago. We're kind of having to think through these things in a lot of what-if type scenarios. With so many unknowns still remaining, we don't have a passage of a school finance bill. We don't have a tax package. There seems to be a lot of discord over these items right now at the legislative level. We don't know what the governor will do once he gets the bill, and we don't know what the Supreme Court will do once they review it. So we're still not in much better position than we were the last time we chatted about a shutdown possibility. Any of our plans are purely based on supposition.
The analogy that we've been using as we talk about this is appropriate when we think of Kansas and you think of tornadoes. And you think about the incredible damage a tornado can cause, and while the conditions may be right, no one really knows if the tornado is going to land, where it's going to land, and how wide a swath of destruction that tornado may cause. So we live in this area and we all plan on potential of a tornado. And that's very much what we're having to do when we think about a shutdown. There's a tornado being predicted. It is out there on the horizon. We have no idea when or where or how that might occur and to what extent it will impact us. So it could be a disruption, or it could be devastating when it comes to our ability to prepare and be ready for kids in the fall. If you think through best case scenario, the House is currently debating the school finance formula. They finally pulled the tax out of the school finance formula. That something happens between now and Friday. It takes several days before the final language is written by the revisers to go to the governor. The governor has 10 days in which to sign or veto. So let's say he signs it. If the Supreme Court moves at lightning speed for the Supreme Court, they're going to give both sides, if we follow past practice, about 10 days to prepare their arguments to come back and talk about what's the law that's been signed. As of June 30th, because of the block grant, the way it was written, we don't have supplemental or general or supplemental funds. They no longer exist. The law sunsetting wipes them out. So when we're sitting here first part of June and you look at the time frame that it takes, we're now into the at best, the early part of the third week of June. The court gives both sides 10 days to prepare arguments. They come, they do that. Again, lightning speed. If they review it within 5 days, we're pretty lucky. Well, guess what? We're now at June 30th or past. Now, what does the court do in that time period? Maybe they would say, we'll extend it because we're giving you. If for any reason they find inadequate or unequitable based on some pieces there, now it's bounce back, the governor, 10 days or better to call a special session, and the legislature has to come back. So you can see how this time frame easily gets us into mid to late July, and we still don't have a school finance formula. And we don't know what's going to happen. Again, that tornado, we can see it, but is it going to touch down? Are we going to be completely prohibited from expenditures, or will there be some latitude in there? So it is difficult as we think about how do we prepare for this, in that those potential scenarios. We know they're calling for tornadoes, so it's business as usual until there's one spotted in our backyard, or we get to tier 2, which is a partial interruption of services. Can we keep utilities and some of those other things going? We don't know if we'll be given that latitude. Or you get to the kind of that nuclear option, which is a full shutdown, saying you don't have funds, you can't not expend them. So that time frame probably isn't July 1 necessarily, maybe mid-July, and that's just supposition because nobody knows. And now you can see how that elongates out. So legislature comes back, they pass something, they think it's going to meet adequacy and equity this time around. We start that whole scenario again with the timeline of the court. And so it is, after 108 days plus, because if you think about the block grant, the whole idea of the block grant was to give the legislature 2 years in which to write a new school finance formula. Well, we're 2 years and 108 days past that point, and this is that potential on the horizon. So this is the difficulty for school districts planning and not knowing what you can do, can't do, what funds you'd be able to allocate resources from, because it's unknown. Nobody knows, because we've never reached this brink before in the state. So,
Betty?
I think even closer to home, and something that is worth noting, we in Kansas are living in this self-imposed tornadic zone. Other states still have money. And the possibility of seeing an exodus of our teachers and other staff going to other states that can afford to pay them is very real. We are looking at teacher shortage. How do we encourage individuals to go into teaching? Yet, when it comes time to compensate them for their efforts, we drop the ball. And what bothers me is, again, this is just here. There are other states that are showing a recovery much faster. They are doing right by public education and educators. What is to hold our, and we talk about quality teachers, what's to hold them here? That's a real problem. And then once we're in the midst of the results of a tornado, I'm not sure if there is a recovery. And that's just a very real point that I just want to throw out there, just because I can.
And if you think about the potential impact areas, which is the next slide, these are just a few of areas we have to think about. And depending on when timing happens, when there might be an impact, let's look at facilities and technology. And I'm gonna pull out technology as one. We'll start shutting down our major systems, not literally flipping the switch as we've been concerned about having to do if we couldn't keep utilities on. But I do believe that's not as great a concern as it used to be because of conversations with Westar and some of the others. But for us to end 1 year fiscally and student management system, we have several weeks of work that have to happen to roll from the 16-17 calendar year to the 17-18 calendar year. If that happens during that time period that we're needing to do that type of work, it still has to be done to be able to start school. So there are so many different components to this based on degree and when that will have ripple effects. You know, and I've talked to folks, they go, well, if they shut you down for 4 or 5 days, the legislature, they'll get their act together, they'll come back and everything will be good. No, 4 or 5 days doesn't mean just catch up a little and everything runs on the calendar we have predicted. School districts, this is some of our busiest time over the next several months in preparation to have everything in place, ordering food, technology, our legacy system rollovers, you know, all those types of things, HR, getting the teachers in place, the paras in place, the food service in place. This is when we do a huge amount of our work to prepare for the school year, and disruption to that has an almost guarantee in my mind of having an impact on the start of school potentially. You know, again, day or so, but if we get to the point when this happens, it becomes very problematic. So, and that isn't the sky is falling. It's we, as you've heard me say this over and over, we have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. That those plans we put in place never have to get dusted off.
Superintendent Allison, I have a question, because in the tiers that you've laid out here, tier 1 is business as usual, and you've said this is where we are right now. We're just moving on and hoping everything goes well. Timeline-wise, you kind of laid that out for us a little bit, but at what point are we forced into looking at tier 2 and tier 3? Are we talking about a couple of weeks from now when we have another board meeting? What kind of timeline is going to force us into thinking we've got to move down into the other
This is
areas?
just best guess. My crystal ball would be exactly that. At the next board meeting, you might have to start talking about tier 2. Because if we get to the, you know, late in the month in June, and we still are working through this process, still don't have definitive answer. If something gets done in Topeka and it's in front of the courts, until the Supreme Court gives us some type of direction here, we just don't know. So I do think that it becomes much more critical if we're still, you know, 2 weeks from now, we don't have any better clarity or idea of a timeline. Then we have to begin to talk about what would potential interruption of services look like for these areas.
Okay, because if we move into that or into tier 3 with full shutdown, from what you said, our money stops the end of June because of the plan that we're on with the state, correct?
Technically. And we don't know whether the Supreme Court would grant some latitude there. This is just such an unknown because we haven't been here before. there's no basis really for us, even under Montoy, to go back and look at. We can kind of see how the courts gave the legislature some extra time to get there, to get something that would meet constitutional muster, but we're not even where that legislature was at this point. So I think when we get a couple weeks down the line, if there hasn't been some progress, then we need to start talking more carefully about what does Tier 1 or Tier 3 look like.
Okay. Mike?
Looking back here just a little bit, on the slide that starts SB 19, possible increases, it's showing year one that we're going to be getting $24 million more. And it says that we have the need of $8.2 million to meet our increases. If I'm the general public, I'm going to be going, what are you going to do with the rest of that money? That's a lot of millions to be spending. What is there? I know there's no easy answer. I realize some of it goes to special ed, which is protected and other things, but what are we looking at there?
Well, I think that's part of what you'll have to come back and take a look at. When, while $2 million sounds like a lot of money, because that's what we're talking about when we look at the general fund. If you look at the slide that shows, just as you're looking at our breakdown of where we need the 8.2, $2 million doesn't fill in. It doesn't do steps and tracks. It doesn't even fund half of that aspect. One of the interesting pieces about SB 19 is the legislature is firmly convinced that if they target or put accountability measures on that lowest 25%, they've met the goal. And that's not what the court said in its entirety. So there's less than $100 million of the total that they're talking about that goes to the base state aid or the general fund. The other piece goes to all those targeted funds. And targeted means there are restrictions to those funds. So we look at $13.9 million, but those are going to go to targeted areas. CTE, not a lot, but some. Special ed, some of the at-risk, which doesn't allow us the latitude. So that's a real concern with what's on the table, not only just the adequacy, but the way in which they focus those dollars aren't going to give school boards a lot of leniency or options when they take a look at their budgets.
You mentioned steps and tracks, and that's salaries. What would you project that we would need to get back in the game as far as salaries? Are we 10% behind, 20% behind? I know that when we looked for your replacement, couldn't play in the game because we couldn't find enough money by a lot. Are we that way with teachers too?
Not. That's a tough question to answer as you take a look. Are you looking on a statewide basis, or are you looking at a regional basis? As we looked last year and talked about during budget, when you looked at, and we took some of those key areas, a bachelor's plus 10, bachelor's plus 20, masters, and we looked at those and compared our salary structure. We were typically in the top 3, both state and regionally, top 4 or 5 in some of those, because it's just the way school districts do that. You may see areas that get loaded. Our benefits, even though we started this year with the premium, our benefits, when you looked at costs out of pocket for benefits and you looked at salary, made us, again, in that top quartile. We'd like to be in that top 3 all the time. So I couldn't say off the cusp whether that's 2% or 3% or how that looks. And part of it is, districts don't stand stand pat. So you see swings in different school districts in the way and allocation of their budget. We'd have to take a look at that again.
I mean, if you look at the major budget modification sheet, you can see there were 4 times wages were frozen. So you at least know we're four adjustments behind if you looked at it from that perspective. But to
And
put a
that's-
percentage, we'd have to do a little
And it
work on that.
varies in comparison as we look from comparative districts. I think the real focus is around which of the districts we're competing with on a daily basis. Do we compete with those on the eastern side or the far west side? Yes, particularly for new teachers coming out. But as you look at veteran teachers, and there were some of those years where we were frozen and they may not have been, and other years where we gave and they didn't. So it really is almost you have to compare it district to district.
You did a fine job answering that question.
Okay.
You got what I needed. I know that was a tough one. I just trying to figure out where this is all coming down and how Topeka's looking at it. I don't think they're got their hearts in it yet.
Yeah, from a competitive standpoint, that's something we always want to look at. And to me, part of that bottom line is that comparison of not just flat salary, but, movement, benefits, those types of things, so that if I'm a master's plus 30 on the pay scale, what am I actually taking home? We get one of our districts neighboring districts to the west. There will be, on a yearly basis, some of our staff that will decide that because they look at the salary schedule, they're going to that district. And then invariably, a couple of them will come back and say, once they sat and they looked at that, and then they sat and they looked at what a family health benefit was going to cost, that was a sizable pay cut. Might be $2,000 on the pay scale, but it was $8,000 out of their pocket when it came to benefits. So I think you've got to look at the full picture so that we're getting a realistic comparison. And to me, it's always, what do I actually get to take home and put in the bank? And that's something that we look at each year.
And as we've kind of worked through what budget process we can work through at this point, we are developing a fairly lengthy wish list, for lack of a better term, as far as positions and needs of the different programs in the schools that we're accumulating for Dr. Thompson to discuss, as far as prioritizing where the money, if and when and if it comes to us, how that gets spent. So we'll have some more of that information to come.
Okay, I do have a question on that, the slide of yours that says major budget modifications 2010 through 17. Yes, that one. Because I think it's important for us to point out that the bottom of that is $97 million that we've cut over this period of time. And so there's lots of places that this money's going to have to go to re-support our district in ways that we used to be able to do.
There are a lot of holes. We've dug a lot of holes.
Yeah.
We are going to have to fill.
And, what concerns me is we know we've got 8.2 million without adding anything for our employees, and we can only spend 11.1 with this SB 19 bill.
Right. There'll be a little
But there'll be
crossover,
some-
but for the most part, that's correct.
Yeah, because the other is weighted and targeted for special ed and other things.
Right.
Correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
So as we work through that framework and we address all the potential impact areas, we really do hope that the court will give us some guidance around June 30th so we know what we are able to do legally after that date, whether they extend a period until they make a final decision. We've been in discussions with KSD staff, and they're as confused as we are as far as what those next steps will be. So we all are waiting on some guidance at this point. So as kind of a recap, the bill, Senate Bill 19, this was as it's now back in committee. As it moves forward, if it is passed by the House and Senate, could still be deemed inadequate by the court. as Mr. Allison said, it's almost impossible at this point to have a bill signed by the governor and reviewed by the court by a June 30th deadline. It's more likely we're going to get into July. But until that point, it's going to be business as usual unless we receive definitive instruction. Otherwise, we're preparing for the worst, hoping for the best for Kansas kids and teachers, and that a reminder that this is really uncharted waters for us. The situation is unprecedented, and we simply just don't know yet what the Supreme Court might do and what decisions we need to make until we have some guidance.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much.